Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon or good evening, depending on where we are. On behalf of Fokus and OECD Watch, we are very happy to welcome you to this webinar, focusing on the gender perspective on human rights due diligence. My name is Per Bondevik. I'm a senior advisor at Fokus, working on business and human rights with the gender perspective. Fokus is an umbrella organization for the development part of a great number of Norwegian gender-based and women's rights organizations. The purpose of this webinar is to share thoughts, experiences on the main hurdles to fight gender inequalities and gender-based violence, give some inputs on tools that are available, and also get feedback on to what extent these tools are actually meeting the needs and what more needs to be done. How to overcome the main hurdles in fighting gender inequality. And we're really happy to have with us a great group of speakers and panelists who will shed light and share their perspectives on this. The agenda, in brief, it's split in three parts. First, we will have an introductory message, then a first round of a panel, a brief presentation of some of the tools that we have selected, and then a second round with the panelists reflecting upon the tools, but also focusing on other solutions, so to speak. And finally, some concluding remarks. Please use the Q&A session for comments or questions, and we will do our best to include them in the second panel if possible, and if not, we will address them jointly with the other panelists in a written form following the webinar that will be shared back with the participants. Yes, I think with not much more ado, I'm happy to invite Surya Dev to give us an introduction and link the gender lens also to the UN guiding principles. He's currently a professor of the Macquarie Law School in Sydney, among other roles, and have published extensively on the issue of business and human rights in general, and also on the gender perspective. Surya Dev is part of the UN High Commissioner of Human Rights Working Group on Business and Human Rights, and we're also played a key role in the 2019 publication of linking the gender lens to the UN guiding principles. So Surya, I'm really happy to give you the floor and looking forward to what you have to share. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Per, for the invitation and organizing this important event. It's really my great pleasure to share some reflections about this particular theme, which has been very close to my heart in the last several years of my work as part of the working group. Let me start with a very simple question. Why is a gender perspective critical to human rights due diligence? And to me, the answer is very simple. The answer is that all the rights holders which are impacted by the business activities, either in a positive manner or a negative manner, we are not a homogeneous group. We are different because of our age, sex, our education, migrant status, sexual orientation, and other characteristics. And because of these differences, we experience the positive or negative impacts of business activities differently. It is therefore very critical that when we talk about human rights due diligence by businesses, that is sensitive to those differences, those experiences of rights holders which are different, and those expectations that are different for men and women, for persons of LGBTI community, and so on and so forth. And because of these different experiences, the working group felt way back in 2017 that we need to provide more guidance. And I think that is the context within which I led this work of the working group, which resulted in the gender guidance, which was presented to the Human Rights Council in June 2019. So I'm very pleased that the guidance continues to make an impact and influence all the actors, not only businesses, but also states and other international organizations in terms of what is the relevance of adopting a gender perspective in conducting human rights due diligence. I look forward to listening to a very distinguished panel of experts in terms of the challenges, the tools that are available, and how those tools can be used to overcome the challenges and barriers we face. But I would like to make two initial remarks. When we talk about gender, we should not equate this to women. The concept of gender is much wider. Of course, our gender guidance focused only on the issue of women, but we made it very clear that this guidance is complementary to what other guidance and tools are available for LGBTI people. So I think we should be conscious of this, that it is not a limiting document merely for women. Rather, the issue is that any one of us, men, women, or persons who do not feel comfortable in falling into these two binary categories, their experiences are taken into account. And my last point for now is the importance of intersectionality. We should also not assume that all women are the same. All women may have different experiences. And I think that element, whether this is about discrimination or the experiences or the sensitivity to those diverse experiences, we have to adopt an intersectional approach. So whether these are the governments or the civil society actors or businesses or trade unions for that matter, everyone should be sensitive to those differences. And I very much hope that the events like this would raise more sensitivities and awareness, and all the relevant actors, including businesses, will take seriously the gender dimensions to human rights due diligence. Thank you very much. And I would like to pass this back to Per.
Thank you very much, Surya. That was very helpful to have that perspective shared right at the outset. I am Marion Ingrams. I am the coordinator of the OECD Watch Network, which is a network that focuses on seeking corporate accountability via the OECD. And I really appreciate Surya's remarks, especially focusing on intersectionality. I think we're looking here at some of the persistent barriers to overcoming gender discrimination and gender violence in this sector. And I think one of the key challenges is that the women that are working in the garment sector often do have such different backgrounds of stigma based on their ethnicity or their caste or their age or a disability. So I think that's part of the challenge that we need to overcome. And you're helping us do that by pointing out the issue and how high it should be as a focus point for businesses and for other stakeholders involved in the issues. So I want to introduce now Chidi King, who will be our moderator for this panel. Chidi, thank you for joining us today. Chidi King has a distinguished career also in working on diversity and inclusion issues. She is currently the branch chief of gender equality, diversity, and inclusion at the International Labour Organization. And before that, she's had a long history on these issues. She was previously with the Equality Department of the International Trade Union Confederation. She was also an Equality and Rights Officer of the Public Services International Global Union Federation and a Policy Officer on Employment Rights at the Trade Union Congress. I know her initially from seeing her present herself on a panel on issues related to gender. And something that really stuck out to me at the time was her warmth and her candor and her thoughtfulness in addressing from a union perspective what unions were doing well and what unions could also be doing differently to address gender issues, starting from within themselves, looking outwards. And that's something that I hope Chidi will encourage in the panelists today, that we all look critically at our own roles. We have panelists from different stakeholder groups. And encourage the panelists to think what really can be done differently, what needs to be done differently to address this problem that we all recognize and have recognized for some time is plaguing this industry. So with that, I'll leave it, I'll pass to Chidi, but thank you for joining us. We look forward to the panel today.
Thank you so much, Marion, and hello to all participants joining us from all over the world. I'd like again to extend my own thanks to Suri and Marion for that wonderful introduction that really sets us up well for the discussion ahead, and putting the framing very clearly through the lens of intersectionality when we look at gender. So not to delay further, I'm so happy to have the privilege of introducing a very distinguished panel today. We have with us Shiraja Munira. Munira is the Global Women Empowerment Manager of Lindex. She has a wealth of experience, having been involved in policymaking, building strategy, implementing management systems, and ensuring compliance, audit, assessment, women's empowerment, CSR, research and training. She specialized in developing and running efforts aimed at addressing working conditions, labor rights, creating an inclusive workplace, and managing industry improvement processes in global supply chains. Also extremely pleased to introduce Marion Peppercam. At FNV Mondial, or Mondial FNV, I should say, Marion is a gender focal point and policy officer on India and Indonesia. She's a trained anthropologist and a human rights professional, and has over 10 years of experience working on labor rights issues in, amongst others, the garment sector. Mushmi Saranghi from Footwear Foundation is the regional coordinator for gender equality and also the program manager there. She's worked in development cooperation for 16 years with a particular focus on gender equality and child rights. She's led the development of programs on women's empowerment, on child labor, and ecumenical relations. And finally, but certainly not least, we have Rekha Chakravarti, who is the Director for Business and Human Rights at Cividep, India. And she's been with Cividep since 2016. She leads research on labor conditions and employment relations in global supply chains, and is presently involved in a research study with Cardiff University on grievance mechanisms and access to remedy for garment workers in Bangalore. So let me get straight to the first question for all our panelists. And this is a bit of a lightning round. So I will ask you to just be brief in your initial answers. From your experience coming from such diverse sectors, working with an NGO, a multi-stakeholder initiative, a trade union organization, and a buying company, where and why do women's rights violations, including this persistent reporting of sexual violence, harassment, and abuse, occur in the garment sector? Rekha, if you could start with you, please, for your observations.
Yeah, thank you, Chidi. To start off with, Cividep and Cardiff University has built a longitudinal data bank of workplace grievances in Bangalore's garment factories, tracking the progress, from the onset of the grievance to its final outcome. And over a period of 2 years and an analysis of 600 workplace grievances, we see that rights violation, violence, and harassment occurs in all aspects of work in global garment supply chain. It happens at the time of recruitment, during employment, and during the entire cycle of a worker as they move factories every few years. And here it's important to talk about violence, especially in the context of how it's defined under C190 as a range of unacceptable behaviors and practices or threats that result in physical, psychological, sexual, or economic harm. Because the forms of violence and harm that workers experience in global garment supply chain includes all of these: economic or financial violence, physical, verbal, sexual, psychological, emotional violence, and mainly distress that workers experience in their day-to-day lives, which is not adequately captured. For example, our grievances data show that the menace of penalty is endemic in garment factories. This is an ILO indicator of forced labor, and most importantly, as a form of violence, it does not convey a physical image of bodily harm. But workers face threats of penalizing against what is considered as unacceptable behavior on a daily basis. And the threats can range from increase in workload, not sanctioning leave, non-payment or delay in payment of wages or overtime wages, threats of dismissal from work, threat to confine workers to spaces on factory floor as a form of punishment, threats against breaks, and threats of non-cooperative behavior in helping workers to access their statutory entitlements. So the menace of penalty is endemic, often not spotted, and it causes immense emotional and psychological distress to workers. Similarly, in the footwear sector, women are overrepresented in the unskilled or low-skilled categories. So the wage gap is a gendered wage gap, where factory workers in the footwear sector face similar rights violation and violence as garment workers. there is an entire category of invisible workers in the form of home workers in the footwear sector. Whereas in the garment factory, work that was previously done within households moved into factories for commercial production. In the case of home workers, the lack of recognizing them as workers on par with factory workers amounts to continuation of how labor itself is understood in a gendered manner. And I want to stress on recognition here and use Charles Taylor's work on recognition, because recognition is a vital human need. Recognition, according to Charles Taylor, has normative, psychological, and material dimensions. So the non-recognition of home workers as workers not only amounts to rights violation, but it's also a form of violence. So I'll stop here, Chidi.
Thank you very much, Rika. That was indeed a lightning first presentation by you. There was so much packed into there, into that presentation, giving us so much food for thought. You focused as well on the fact that violence needs to be understood as not only physical violence, and you mentioned some of the psychological aspects of violence and harassment, which is as important to address. You also mentioned C190, which is the International Labour Organization's Convention on Violence and Harassment, which was adopted in 2019. And really is the first international labour standard that deals with this issue and does provide some concrete guidance and tools to address this pernicious issue. I like the fact that you really did identify that violence and harassment relates not only to behaviours, but to practices, and those practices also need to be addressed. And this is something that the convention as well deals to, things like, workload pressures, the practice of not allowing workers proper breaks or entitlement to rest. All of these are things that need to be taken into account. So thank you very much for that. I'll move on to, very quickly to our next presenter to pick up where you left off. So Mushmi, over to you.
Chidi, you asked a very complex question of where does it exist? And the simple answer to that is it exists everywhere. So if you look at gender-based violence is prevalent in all sectors, in all cultures, and in all continents. So the garment and footwear sector is also representative of that fact. So it does exist, and we need to strongly recognize that and not put it as an issue of, say, someone else in the sector, but it exists for all brands, all suppliers, all countries where garment is produced. So that is the first step that we need to take, that recognize that gender-based violence exists in the garment sector. Unpacking it a little bit more of why does it exist, we've all been talking about it. And fundamentally, there are like three very strong areas. One is the purchasing and sourcing models of brands, which directly impact the working conditions of suppliers. And these purchasing practices, particularly if I have to point it out, are these contracts between brands and suppliers, contracts that are so vague in areas of pricing, financial responsibility, that it limits the bargaining power of suppliers vis-a-vis brands, which has an impact of how workers' social security is formed, because it's all correlated. If you look at insufficient lead times that brands give to suppliers, this results in excessive overtime, subcontracting, outsourcing, casual labor, and whom does it impact the most? So garment workforce is both men and women, but we all know that majority of this workforce is women. So of course, the impact on women workers is much higher, and most of the women in the garment sector are in lower paid positions, do not have enough voice, are not part of unions, so they cannot even have access to remedy when it comes to these violations. So the one area that we need to look into is the sourcing and purchasing practices of brands which have an impact on gender-based violence, both physical, psychological, emotional, financial. The second one, which I want to reiterate is, and which both Surya Deva and you both pointed out, is the intersectionality. We cannot club workforce as just men and women. Even within women, we have to look at the intersectionality, have to look at age, caste, religion, ethnicity, migrant status of the women workforce, because each of these have implications of the extent of violations, the precarious work conditions in these that they work. If I take the example of COVID, the first people to lose work were migrant women workers. And when you look at, again, access to remedies, since they are migrant, they are not able to navigate through the local remedy systems because of language barriers, because of less representations in the work committees or in unions in the local unions. Then again, when you look at age, this sector has huge number of young workers, child laborers. And the industry prefers it that way because it has a docile workforce that will not complain when working conditions are not good. They would continue to work in precarious conditions at very low wages and continue to contribute to the huge profits and the power imbalance that exists in this sector. So these are some of the areas that we need to focus on why they exist and look at the root cause of these labor violations. Specifically also gender-based violence and the power relations in the global supply chain. How can we in our work look at, breaking this imbalance, I wouldn't say balance, of the power relation that exists right now to address gender-based violence in supply chains?
Thank you. Thanks so much, Mushmi. And again, I think, your presentation has given us so much food for thought. Similarly, you have picked up on issues that relate very much to the structural issues that give rise to some of these very serious deficits, including violence and harassment. I know that Rika spoke, for instance, about recognizing the fact that some workers simply are not recognized as workers, home-based workers, for instance, within supply chains, pointing again to the importance of power relations. Some workers, of course, tending to be majoritarily women, majoritarily from poorer backgrounds, perhaps, going back to the questions of intersectionality that everyone has mentioned so far, and the importance of really building that into approaches that are designed to promote, gender equality. Let's move on to Marion Peppercam from Mondial FNV. Over to you.
Yes, thank you, Chidi, and also thank you, Reka and Mushmi. I think much of what I wanted to raise has also been said by you. I wanted to highlight here that gender-based violence is, I think, one of many forms of gender-based discrimination in the garment sector. And I think that is already something you highlighted as well. For example, this gender pay gap is endemic through all regions. Men often make around the minimum wage, which is still far below the living wage. Women workers make even less. But also, I think what Mushmi already said, employment for women is less secure. We've done research together with the Wage Indicator Foundation during the COVID pandemic, starting in May 2020, and keeping continuous track of what was going on in over 200 garment factories in Indonesia. And there you also saw that while the total number of jobs in these factories went down, the number of male workers employed there increased by 31%. So actually, that's quite a shocking figure, I think, if you consider what that means for female workers. The same survey also showed that in the majority of factories, relatively much more men have permanent contracts than women do. And all these factors combined, so the poverty wages, the different forms of violence, the insecurity of employment, make it very hard for women to speak out against, for example, gender-based violence or other forms of gender-based discrimination, and make it hard for them to organize and associate and claim their rights either individually or collectively. So that is what I wanted to add to what Mushmi and Reka already said.
Thank you very much again, and thanks again for reminding us about the importance to really tackle the root causes of these structural inequalities. Looking at the fact that, yes, again, I think you've pointed to unequal power relations, the fact that women find themselves very often in the most precarious, the most poorly paid, working conditions that very often that, their right to organize is not respected or recognized. So their ability, therefore, to engage in the transformation of their own working conditions is further limited. Let me go straight now to Munira. Munira, over to you.
Thank you, Chidi, and thank you all of the panelists and distinguished presenter here. Thank you, Surya, also for the impactful statements. So, picturing a life of a woman, a poor woman, even, or educated woman, or a professional woman, the millions of faces reveals the same. So a women's life is not as easy or similar as men in society. However, in many sectors, we saw the women workers constitute more than half of workforce, but yet women often get poorer conditions and at a higher risk of being subjected to gender-based violence in workplace. In Lindex, we believe that women are our inspiration. So with this commitment to sustainable development, sustainable improvement, I am really happy to be a part of these interactions and part of Lindex, which strongly supports gender equality and strengthens women active participation. So we value 3 pillars: social, environment, and we women actually, and to create an inclusive and decent and sustainable workplace. We have certain tools using and that based on the United Nations Women Empowerment Principles guidelines, also through the national and international laws and the COCs, and also measuring the KPIs for long-term business benefit and improving gender situation. So to us, we women is not just a project, but also we took it as a everyday development as program. Why I'm saying this? Because more than that, women driving this force to make us work and creating a workplace that's really inclusive and regards to gender is a key point of goal. So how we see in our context that in society, how they are in community or in society, in family, how they are being underprivileged or being harassed or being suffered. So this is the goal that we are trying to make it industry overall. And while the majority of governments worker, if I'm saying from that perspective, most of are women, the majority of leadership is men. And they create an atmosphere that reflects the worldview and often reinforce gender inequities. So achieving impact for women, we want to see a woman in position in leadership, creating an atmosphere that supports their goals and values. It is really hard to find where women's rights violations do not exist. So in my point of view that we observe that this is a social stigma and females do not raise their voice, whether it is in terms of discrimination or harassment or sexual exploitation or case or gender violence. So they always keep at high level of blaming for anything. And if I state all about, I will be short of time, but statements must require some examples like when they have their salary, they have to hand over this to their male guardian. They stay in factory gate. So such this, from the very beginning of being a girl in the family or in the society, opportunity for food or education or livelihood or compared to prolonged, this is more like to a baby boy, more like to be privileged rather than a baby girl. So regardless of policies, even the country facilities or free education, nothing works. So on the other hand, where poverty shades truly the girls or women are used as earning products by any means at different ages and consequences, we all know the vulnerability, the discrimination, exploitation, trafficking, and illegal activities. So women are, who are the women out of poverty? The culture of male-driven society hinders all those maps. So they do not have the decision-making authorities or access to their doing own job or selecting for the type of jobs. It's usually done by their family guardian, father, husband or son, or even say they do not have any access to the legal matters, spending own earnings or planning for their children or for education or for their employment. So no decision-taking authority in family matters. So even if I come to the workplace now, she never been supported in domestic activities or household chores by available at home someone, not even for the simple task. And these all tasks like her only responsibility, and as if she bound or born to do so. This reason leads them back from their leadership position and avoid domestic hassle and extra pressure. So the less managing capacity and communication, time and stress, decision-making priorities, or managing physical or mental health. So here it's badly needed, the leadership skill development, highly recommended, and we have our efficiency to perform as a human being, but is that we can do every day in the same way? So that's the way of building capacity we Lindex are doing for in our supply chain countries. And even after long hours of struggle at the workplace, we see always that it is very hard to prevent the efficacy, and they never have recognition on their eligibility, lending chances in leadership position. So, or very few position. So they always been underestimated or non-cooperation from their colleagues or seniors, and negotiating for the overtime and hours and day. So it is very important to have the upskilling opportunity for their personal and professional advancement as well. And also,
thank you so much.
So that is we need to done for the whole chapter.
Indeed. And I'm sorry for rudely interrupting your very important reflections there. I'm just very mindful of the time. And I think, the element that you brought in there, reminding us that what happens in the workplace is not, the workplace is not isolated from the real world. And these problems are really problems that are deeply rooted in our societies. And we really need to tackle these gender norms, or gender stereotypes that, follow into the workplace, in our societies as well. Want to move swiftly on to the next round of questions. We heard all our panelists there really outline some of the deep-seated problems, affecting women's participation in labor markets, particularly within the supply chains. We've heard about the gender pay gaps, we've heard about precarious working conditions, we've heard about violence and harassment, we've heard about the lack of access to leadership positions and all of the things that influence and impact them. But none of these problems are particularly new to us. We're familiar with the adverse conditions that women face in garment supply chains. So I'll ask you, why hasn't the problem been solved yet? In your experience, what are the persistent barriers that are preventing resolution of these problems? And I'll turn first to you, Munra, for your observations on this.
Thank you again. This is actually, if I say, the stigma, and this prevention motion depends on respecting women as human beings and changing the mindsets to equity to equality, measuring the achievement levels in different sectors. This is what I'm again saying, to create an inclusive workplace, to be respectful environment that women as potential as valued regardless of culture, race, color, religion, education, or language. We found this, it is identified that whatever the problems, but the stigma for the male leading mentality and the policies what are in place, but it often seems to overrule those and require monitoring against the taking necessary action. And also that is to establish a baseline of this framework, it is to mitigate the violence and harassment in the world of work. So even being technically efficient, the workers are not able to protect or prevent themselves from this harassment and violence or discrimination. So we people might not be able to perform every day in a same way I said before. So those managing skills are really needed. Them the information of human rights and labor rights, what they supposed to have, and the mind interpretation of the entrepreneur is very important, playing a key role to play here. And also the mechanism and the other certain skills they need to perform their job perfectly and to prevent and to make them as a human being. They usually think that yes, we are weaker. We suppose we we should not supposed to say this, and this is not the thing we can do. So that's the willpower they have, and if they have little bit supported and strengthened enough, so they can be more potential. And of course, the mechanism inside the production floors and inside the supply chain, it is very important to create the grievance mechanism establishment and also other skills simultaneously at different level of management, middle management, and also to the workers and other committee members, I believe. So we are here in Lindex, we have a cafe that is the extended hand of grievance mechanism we are trying to set up, and this is really working. We are measuring all these things through our tools, and these tools are really expressing that it is helpful enough to build a management system, the HS system, that can really track out and find out the root causes that already Mushmi said that it is very important to find out the root causes. So those are the mechanism, and tracking those datas, measuring for the KPIs we are trying to reach to our strategic level following the roadmaps. So that's the progress needs to be monitored and followed perfectly entire the supply chain, I believe.
Thank you, Munira. And we're going to hear a little bit more about some tools in the second half of this. And I noticed that you focus very much on the need to change mindsets, cultural mindsets, the way that women are viewed, the way that women's work is valued. Again, understanding women in its broadest sense, the use of the term women rather in its broadest sense. Let me hand straight over to you, Marion, for your reflections.
Yes, yeah. As Chidi said, I'm from the Netherlands, and I think we made world news in the past month with some affairs on women's rights violations and sexual harassment, like with The Voice, the talent show, where young female candidates have been harassed and violated by powerful men. We had the Ajax affair, where the director harassed female employees. To me, I think that really shows sexual harassment is not at the workplace, is not related to specific cultures, to norms on gender. It's everywhere where power imbalances exist. And the garment sector is not unique in that, but it has characteristics that really exploit and even increase these already existing power imbalances. And I think Reka Mushmi will also say more about the structure and the characteristics of the garment sector. I would like to highlight one issue here, and that is that the sector systematically undermines unions throughout all production regions. For example, the Business and Human Rights Resource Center recently documented 9 factories that used COVID as an excuse to fire almost 5,000 unionized workers throughout different production regions. Only 2 cases, these have been resolved. So the essence here, if workers, both men and women, take efforts to address power imbalances, these are systematically undermined by the sector. And if they succeed, and I want to highlight here an example from Indonesia, where trade unions in some regions successful negotiated higher wages, you see that the garment factories move to regions where there's lower pay. So that leaves the unions and the workers, of course, empty-handed and without jobs and without lower pay. So that is, I think, one of the structural, characteristics that really hinders change in the sector.
Thank you so much, and again, thank you for bringing us back to the issue of who holds power and who wants to hold on to power, which gets us to the root of some of the questions we're talking about, and therefore, when we're looking for solutions, it's absolutely critical to address this issue of power. Straight over to you, Reka. Thank you.
Thank you, Munira, and thank you, Marion. I agree with Marion. Gender-based violence in global supply chains should not be seen simply as a cultural phenomena. when we speak of global value chains, the analysis has to be transnational. Spatially limiting this to the local or the cultural, it erases the global from the narrative. And if we do that, it also renders invisible the unequal power relations among different actors along the supply chain, and the effects of such asymmetry on human rights outcomes for workers. Mushmi has already pointed out to this. Two, very importantly, violence in global garment value chain is a form of labor discipline and supervision. For example, our grievances data bank points to how access to remedy looks like during the entire course of a grievance. One is that grievances are reported by workers to the HR, as against popular understanding that workers do not report grievances except for sexual harassment cases. Two, what we found that in a majority of the grievances, the HR is either an active perpetrator, which means that the HR is directly perpetrated or involved in the incident of abuse, or is a facilitator, which means the HR is complicit or subservient with operational managers. So in very few grievances, we found that the HR acted as a mediator. That is, the HR mediated in support of a mutually acceptable solution to a specific grievance, taking into account workers' interest. So, from our study, we find that HR is part of the intimidation and violence on the factory floor. So, as a function, the HR is far from supportive of meaningful access to remedy. In fact, what we find is that HR managers, in fact, lack the status to enforce compliance with statutory rights at the workplace. So just to reiterate, violence in global garment value chain is a form of labor discipline and supervision. And this is rooted in the governing logic of global value chains, which is labor arbitrage is at the center of how global value chains operate. So global value chains simply don't take advantage of poor existing labor conditions. They also actively enable the reproduction of the same, for the purpose of extracting production at a very cheap cost. Thank you, Chidi. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Rekha. And again, listening to you, the question that comes to my mind is, okay, we need to look at why and how power is wielded. Let me go straight to Mushmi now. We're running a little bit behind time, but Mushmi, over to you for your comments and reflections.
Okay. Sure. Chidi, like you rightly said, that this is not a new issue. What we've heard it many times, but we still have to hear it 100 more times because we need to address this very urgent issue. Because the recognition is there that gender-based violence does exist, but how do we address this is something that we all are struggling with. And if I look at it at a macro level, of course, the structural issue of power imbalance is there. And if you look specifically in the last 25 years, there's been high increase in demand for this high speed, high volume and cheap consumption, which also means that workers in the lower tail of the supply chain, which are largely women workers, are pushed more towards informality and home-based work, where the social security, where the collectivization is even weaker. Not to speak about poverty wages that exist in these informal settings. And you also see a trend because of this demand for cheap consumption that production has been shifting to low and lower middle income countries, predominantly Asia, in search of cheap labor. Also governments, which are highly dependent on this international investment in the garment sector, are in a way coerced to keep the labor laws weak so that you bring in this financial investment in the country. So it's a big nexus between wanting to keep the economy to having laws which support these precarious work conditions, but who suffers in the end? It's the workers suffer in the end, and this whole nexus keeps labor being cheap, labor being in precarious conditions. So we need to work at the structural cause of this power imbalance, need to look at redistribution of power. We've been talking about it, but we need to take urgent action on this of how do we redistribute power here. And a second point that I would want to reinstate is there's a lot happening at a training awareness level, but not happening at a policy level. Like, when you talk to stakeholders, most of them, when they speak, would talk of gender equality as a very urgent issue. But when you take a step back and analyze it, you would not see enough resource attributed to it. You would not see enough policy attributed to it. So the speech and the practice, there's a huge gap. And in each stakeholder. So how do we bridge that gap? How do we put workers at the center of this discussion, not workers in this continuous circle of poverty, on poverty wages that keeps, the brands, the businesses thriving at profits, and the workers getting down further in the supply chain and working in even severe working conditions. So I'll stop here. We need to, bridge this macro and micro interventions that we are doing and look at new solutions to it, because the problem is not new. It's only getting worse, and the urgency to look at it is huge. Yeah, so I'll stop here.
Thank you. Again, thank you very much, Mushmi, for those observations. Let me move very quickly on to the question of solutions now again, and whether there are tools that can help us find the way forward to addressing some of these very deeply entrenched problems, which I think, as you've all pointed out, whether they arise sometimes from mindsets, or whether they manifest as, these structural issues that are rooted in power imbalances. They are persistent. Per, I'm going to hand straight over to you to take us to the presentation of tools. Thank you.
And thanks, Chidi, and panelists, for a lot of insightful and useful comments. We will spend a few minutes just to give you a brief taste of some of the tools that are available for addressing, understanding, and working on gender-based issues. We have with us some of the owners or developers of these tools, and they are all, not surprisingly, consistent with the OECD guiding on due diligence methods, etc., and the UNDPs, and they are slightly different in scope and in their formats. So I don't think I'll spend too much time on sharing this, but as you will see, there are some would give you a scorecard, some would be more guidance, some have case studies, some are sector specific, and they have slightly different target audiences. I will just then, I think, give the word to Marion from OECD Watch to give a brief introduction to their guidance.
Great, thank you, Per. So the guide that OECD Watch created is somewhat unique from the other guides in that it is targeting civil society. So we're not talking to brands and companies with this guide, we're talking to civil society, which could include unions. And the basic way that the guide does this is by, after initially explaining what the sort of problems are cross-sectoral, not just in the garment sector, but agriculture, extractives, etc., for women as workers, as well as community members, as well as human rights defenders. The guide explains with this image, which comes from the OECD's 6 steps of due diligence. Now, the OECD's due diligence guidance does call for companies to implement the due diligence process with a gender perspective. But it gives, for lack of space, it gives about a page instruction on what that means. And so we try to expand upon that in a practical way by going through each of the 6 steps and posing questions that civil society can ask, including asking of victims or workers, in this case, in the garment sector, to find out whether a company has met each step. So just to take an example, for step 2 there in the bottom left corner, you can see, to understand whether a company has adequately identified and assessed actual and potential adverse impacts, the civil society member using this tool can ask the question, have they consulted potentially impacted women and LGBTQ+ workers and community members to learn what specific impacts they are facing? Were some of the consultations for women only, so they could speak freely without men? Were some consultations accessible? Were the consultations accessible in a language they understood at a time that is suitable and doesn't interfere with their home care responsibilities, cooking or handling children at home? Did the consultations engage other women's representatives who might be more free and empowered to speak on some of the impacts, such as NGOs or unions? So the key concept here is it can be hard to understand in this little circle from the OECD what it really means in practice for a company to undertake gender due diligence. We hope that with these types of questions, groups can answer, well, no, a company never showed up and talked to me. And no, my manager was sitting there, my male manager was sitting there during the consultation, so I couldn't speak freely. And no, there was no representative of a local NGO focused on these issues there. That helps the civil society member understand how the company has not met its due diligence with a gender perspective. And then we suggest with this guide how it can be used. It can, as I've said, been used in interviews with impacted groups. And then that in itself can be used for collecting evidence for filing complaints, including by the OECD national contact points, or in direct engagement with companies, pointing out, hey, the company didn't do all of these things, so why not? And also in advocacy with government, pointing out where the breakdown is on the ground with how a company is not translating these steps meaningfully into action. So that's the goal of this tool, and I'll pass on for the next tool to be presented.
Thank you very much, Marion. We're happy to have with us Victoria Reka from BSR to present a tool that they have developed more for at factory level.
Yes.
Over to you, Victoria.
Thank you, Per. And I think we can go probably to the next slide. So yeah, good morning, good afternoon. Super happy to be sharing all of this with you. But yes, to provide another set of frameworks and guidance and tools, I wanted to share with you the Making Women Workers Count framework that we launched with BSR in 2019, where you can find a report and a suggested set of indicators that you can be collecting when it comes to capturing gender disaggregated data and understanding the challenges. So really, this framework provides recommendations to both brands and suppliers on how to conduct deliberate gender-focused due diligence along 4 due diligence phases, which are assessing and analyzing, integrating and acting, tracking and communicating, and it's focused on the garment sector, though it is relevant, I would say, for other sectors as well, with some modifications, of course. But the focus really is around, the indicators, right? And I see a couple of questions that are around, like, what kind of indicators can we be collecting? So we know, and I think it's everybody has shared it in this panel today, that data helps really illustrate sometimes invisible challenges, and it helps build more effective and targeted programs. But we also know that while we have some great examples of brands that are collecting information and data, we know that often brands do not know what gender-specific data they need to be asking for, how to interpret the data, and also suppliers are unclear about the benefits of collecting these additional data points. They don't have resources, they don't have systems or processes in place. So this framework really pays special attention and focus to the assess and analyze piece of the due diligence process that I was talking to you about, and introduces a set of indicators that should be used to measure outcomes for women and men workers, as well as the methodologies for collecting and analyzing the gender data. So it helps the gender data and impact tool, which is really the resource that will help capture the information, helps detect what are the gender gaps that may be present in your supply chain or in your workplace. And it supports also, really undergoing this root cause analysis that has been mentioned as well of the different gaps that we have identified, in order to then be able to take the most pertinent and adequate actions, and then eventually to be able to track improvement. So as you can see here, it's very high level what you can see, but the indicators suggested in the tool cover a wide range of data points, from workforce profile data and business performance indicators such as turnover or absenteeism. That is all information that should be able to be gathered from existing data points, databases, or documents, but it also provides a set of indicators related to worker outcome, workers' perceptions, behaviors, and actually like the social norms that are affecting the workplace. And these do require worker engagement and conducting interviews, surveys, which how are you setting those worker engagement processes, similar to what was being discussed about how are you enabling women voices to actually be heard in these processes. So that's kind of the two main set of indicators. And what are the types of issues that are being addressed with these indicators? Well, it's a wide range of gender sensitive topics, which include agency, so are women really participating in the workforce, health and safety, the economic opportunity, so a lot around, what is the pay gap and so on and so forth, the leadership, gender-based violence, sexual and reproductive health and rights, as well as care responsibilities, as you can see. So it's 6 big categories that we are trying to really understand with the tool. And then furthermore, what we also provide is a number of recommendations on how to take action and really a call for brands and suppliers to partner and join efforts to really drive progress in the workplace. So I really do invite you to take a look and see how this can help you further in your journey. Thank you, Per.
Thank you very much, Victoria. Then I'm happy to invite Nada van Schoenberg from Women Win to share the tool and guidance developed there. Over to you, Nada.
Thank you, Per. My name is Nada. I work for Women Win, and we launched a gender-responsive due diligence platform last year in March. The platform is for companies offering very practical information and resources to help them add a gender lens to their human rights due diligence process. With the platform, our goal is that a gender lens is applied to each of the steps of the process, but it goes beyond adding gender as just one thematic area. It really recognizes the specific needs of different genders and also analyzes how business activities contribute to gender-based inequalities. So on the platform, you find these 6 steps. Of course, from the human rights due diligence, with for each of the steps an elaborate explanation on how you can ensure that step is conducted in a gender-responsive manner, including examples, very practical examples actually, where you can click on apply gender lens and you see the before and after, and also additional resources. We try to link as many resources as possible on this platform. So this session is actually also very helpful for us to ensure that it's complete. And the platform also offers a variety of real-life business cases from different sectors to show how other companies have addressed certain parts of their human rights due diligence process in a gender-responsive manner. And this is actually, we're continuously looking and adding new cases to the platform. And we're also currently developing a self-assessment for companies that will give them direct advice on what could be a next step for them. So it really is a one-stop for just getting all the basic information whenever you're interested in doing gender-responsive due diligence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nada. Women empowerment principles developed by UN Global Compact. The women are probably well known to most of you. 7 principles established some years back. At the gender gap analysis tool, there's developed a set of multiple choice questions in a self-assessment or linked to those 7 principles. It provides an output of a score and suggested actions though for each at the general level and also for each of the questions. So this is also a useful self-assessment tool based on those 7 women empowerment principles for companies who want to take that. And I know that some are also using this in combination with other tools. And also it includes the benchmarking though with the number of companies. There's quite a big number of companies who have used this, and its benchmarking is created based on that though. And of course you recognize the phases also that are found in the OECD guidance on human rights due diligence, although some of the words might differ a bit. SHEDIL is a tool developed by Fokus here in Norway. We've developed guidance for 3 sectors. Of course, it's also based on the UCD's circle. We chose to kind of organize it around 4 different business relationships. Your own business, suppliers, agents, or middlemen, recruiters, etc., and also external stakeholders. The same well-known due diligence steps that you recognize in the other tools. And a bit similar to the OECD Watch tool, we have included a number of key checkpoints under the different tasks, and each step have a similar number of tasks. So it's more like I would call it a structured checklist that would help companies and users to acknowledge, be aware, and understand the issues at stake, and also challenging them on what to do about it. There's an open field for notes, and one typical case could be that using this you end up saying, okay, let's try BSR's tool for assessing or collecting sex disaggregated data at factory level, or let's turn to the Women's Wind collection of cases to see if there are learnings to be done there, etc. So in that sense, these tools are complementary. And of course, I guess we're all more than happy to work with all of you later on to see how we could make these tools come more to use and further develop them, and see to ensure also that we're not duplicating efforts but complementing each other in this important task. Yes, I think I will stop there and then turn the word back to you, Chidi. Thank you. Just to mention briefly that unless you noticed in the chat, there are links to all the tools if you want to click into that. But please wait until after the webinar before you start doing that. Chidi, over to you.
Indeed, thank you very much, Per. Thank you to all the presenters for presenting these very interesting tools. As often happens when we're having very rich and informative discussions, we're running a little bit late with time. So I'm just going to turn back quickly to the panelists and ask you one question, which is, what are your brief reflections on these tools? What are the pros and cons from your perspectives? And what else might be needed and from which actors to address these persistent barriers that we've been hearing about? Over to you, Marion, for the first inputs.
Yes, thank you, Chidi, and thank you also for the presentations on the different tools. I think, I really think it's positive that this issue now receives so much attention. But I also want to highlight a concern I have that by making it separate tools or additional tools, you tend to forget that this is, I think, central to every worker's perception of the situation that's going on. We all have a gender, but we all have other identities. And by creating gender due diligence tools, you almost say that like being a man is still the norm and we look in women in another situation. So I would strongly plead for integrating it in the overall human rights due diligence processes. I think that's something that is also very strong, at least in the OECD Watch approach. What also stood out to me in what Marion said about the OECD Watch guidance is the advice to speak to women and not only about women. I think that is really central from a trade union perspective. And bearing in mind, of course, also Surya's point, women are not a homogeneous group. There's many ways our identities intersect, so bear that in mind. And what I liked, I think, when looking into, for example, the SheDeal tool, that is one that really also included the power imbalances we've been talking about in this discussion. So it does explicitly mention trade unions' rights as a key to changing situations. So to me, that really stood out as a positive example. Comes to what needs to change. I think from trade union perspective, it's obvious that unions, of course, need to become more gender inclusive and gender responsive, show that unions can work for women and take up gender specific concerns. We have been supporting, for example, a union, a very small independent trade union in Indonesia, organizing female workers around the issue of gender-based violence very successfully. The way their approach has now been promoted by the government of Indonesia and other industrial zones. But this case also shows that the sector itself needs to change structurally, because in the past, I think 1.5 years, this union lost most of its members because the garment factories relocated to a cheaper area. So I think it is crucial that we really look into space as to create a sector where workers can safely organize, and where organizing and negotiating for better working conditions does not mean that factories will close, will move to other countries, other regions where work is cheaper. Yeah, I'll leave it with an eye on the time. I'll leave it with that.
Thank you so much. I mean, some very key and important reflections there, and bringing it back again, ultimately, to this question of voice and power. If we're going to change these power imbalances that we're talking about, it's crucial that workers, and especially women workers in absolutely all of our diversities, have that ability to organize and to have a say in changing their own working conditions, which of course also means that their organizations have to change to ensure that they do have that ability to organize within those trade unions and exert themselves within those trade unions. And thank you for reminding us again and again and again. I think this is a very important reminder to keep in our heads, that women are not homogeneous. And when we're looking at tools, we also need to question how well are those tools reflecting this fact, and what is the point of departure? Is the point of departure accepting that, male domination, if I can put it that way, is the norm? Or is it really looking at, okay, well, this is how our societies are structured, and what do we need to do to change, if I can put it this way, coming back to the questions of mindsets, which is not the only question, but how do we need to change mindsets about how societies are structured and how gender norms play out? Thank you. Straight over to you, Rekha.
Thank you, Chidi. I also, I echo points made by Marion. The OECD due diligence guidance, states that responsible business conduct should be embedded into policies and management systems. I think this is crucial. Both SHEDIL and gender responsive due diligence platform explicitly mention women's economic rights. I think this is very important. Talking really concretely about, how to achieve women's economics rights. Similarly, the gender responsive due diligence does not look at women as a homogeneous group. I think that is again important. And two, it includes the building blocks of women's economic empowerment. And among the 8 building blocks, it mentions social protection and recognition of unpaid care work. I think this is really at the center of empowering women, because feminist scholars have long been saying that where women's work is concerned, we cannot simply look at their paid employment. Women's work should include both paid production and their social reproduction responsibilities. So instead of saying that women's unpaid care work has to be recognized, we need to go a step ahead and start looking at how women's unpaid care burden can be reduced. For example, can women's unpaid care and domestic work be included in the calculation of living wages? I think this is something that these frameworks could consider, the explicit linking of paid production with women's social reproduction responsibilities. Now, in terms of what needs to be done and who needs to, what are the actors, who are the actors who needs to bring in change? I think it requires some fundamental changes. For example, as Mushmi and Marion have pointed out, to the power, we need to look at the power imbalances in commercial relations between brands and suppliers. And this should be considered as unfair business practice. And if this is considered as an unfair business practice, what should be done to change brands' business practices? One possible solution is that we need to move towards mandatory standards. We need to accept that voluntary standards and private regulation has not led to any meaningful change. And any mandatory standards, should include not just where the human rights impacts are, but it should also include what drives or causes human rights violation. So for example, if business practices of brands cause human rights violation, they must be included and monitored within your due diligence framework, and action should be taken, against adverse purchasing practices. Second, I think living wages should be mandated as the basis of labor costing in contracts between brands and suppliers. 3, living wages should be gender sensitive. Women's unpaid care and other domestic work in the social reproduction of labor should be included within the calculation of living wages. And I think finally, work intensity should be addressed again through responsible purchasing practices, because often work intensity is the reason for labor discipline and violence. So without some of these fundamental changes, through mandatory standards, sweatshop conditions will be very difficult to overcome. I'll stop here, Chidi. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rekha. And again, taking us further into some solutions that we need to explore. Very important points you made there about the link between paid production and the recognition of women's, reproductive roles, so social reproductive roles in society. The whole question of unpaid care work and domestic work is gaining more and more importance. but it still needs to, if you like, land in terms of concrete actions to recognize and to change certain dynamics. You raised a very important question there about do voluntary standards work? So we have all these tools which are largely, designed to help compliance from a voluntary, starting point. But is it time now to look at mandatory standards? And as we know, there are discussions going on about mandating due diligence. You also mentioned the importance of taking wages out of competition, and again, recognizing when we're talking about wages, the significant contribution that unpaid care and domestic work makes to our economies in general. So thank you very much again to you as well. Oops, excuse me, I'm muting myself there before moving on. Let's move swiftly on then to Munira.
Yes, Chidi. So if I say that those are about tools, how Lindex are applying in our supply chain. So we are using these tools in finding the wage gap. And this is based on the grades. Each grades, this is sexually segregated. And it is very easy to find out the gaps, the amount of gaps. And also it shows the recruitment division, if there are any. And also I would like to share about that the HR system, how the production system linking with the HR system, the worker health and safety conditions, their mental health conditions, their injuries or their attendance or absenteeism or the reason of grievances. So these all are related to those. So the alter percentage indicating something in many different reasons as well. So the tools indicates those data for attendance, absenteeism, or the resignation or turnover or the alter, or it's about injury for sickness, and also the other costs related to clinic for daycare or childcare, and the lactating mothers provision, pre and postnatal care in daycare. So a lot of data when it will be in the HR system, the suppliers by themselves will be able to create a management system. Our target is to strengthen our supply chain countries, the supply chain factories. So tools are always good when they are really easy to use, user-friendly. So the strength, the time, then when they will be able to find out the causes, and they will be able to use those data as their resources, when those data will be applied and ensured for their management system to develop through the following the processes. So it will add more influences to their policies and implementations, and however the follow-up monitoring systems, planning, designing, or in implementation cases. So that will be the change maker. So these changes in policies, where it amended or it circulated to all of the workers at all the level of employees. So that is very important to be communicated in a proper way. So if I say that when I noticed that impact, it is mentioned in the OECD HRDD due diligence guidance step in 5, and that is the implementation alignment at every level. So this is how the wage gap finding or the HR system problem identifying. The due diligence in the gender perspective is to protect, prevent, to mitigate, or to eliminate, and really to establish a whole supply chain, I should say, in expected way, following the SDGs, I believe. So these tools, even applying in the process of productivity enhancing, that make, for the business progress, and how that make the appraisal system with their productivity and their falls or the progress of the productivity day to day, taking their and tracking their amounts of production. So those are the issues and the root causes of different injuries and the different grievances that can really make strengthen their own system. So this guidance state will really can be a good tool for the suppliers, and also the assessment indicators, there should have been some score that earlier it mentioned was when and how we can separate and scale them. This is a good average, or need required based factory, they need more support, they need this sort of support. So that is very important to identify the terms, short, mid and long terms plans for them for real improvement, realistic improvement.
Thank you again, Manira. And again, you know, I think an important observation coming in there about identifying not only the short term, but the longer term planning. Thank you for reminding us of the importance of gender responsive grievance mechanisms and the part that they can play or that they need to play in due diligence processes. Let me go straight to Mushmi and remind participants, please do make use of the question and answer box. We still hopefully will have time to come to some of your Q&As. And even if we don't, we will answer them or endeavor to answer them after this session is over. So Mushmi, please, over to you.
Yeah, you know, I mean, we need these tools, we need these guidances of how can we address gender inequality in the supply chain. But as an MSI, we also recognize this problem ourselves, that there are also many tools and guidances, which sometimes are difficult for brands to navigate or to understand which one to use, to work on this issue. So we see the need for collaboration, not to overwhelm the industry with too many tools, but to look at how we integrate gender in our existing tools as opposed to separate tools for gender issues, and collaboratively look at where we add value to each other when we are developing these tools, rather than having multiple tools that are offered to the industry. The third point that I would like to make here is when we look at these tools, it should be a continuous process. These tools should not be utilized just when you start a business association, as a risk assessment, but rather being continuously used, because working conditions of your purchasing practices keep changing. They're not static. Even the workforce is not static. So it should be continuously used. It should be part of your daily working rather than a one-off event or a one-off activity when you start a business relationship. And again, any tool that we look at it, we have to look, does that tool address or identify the root causes or tells us the symptoms? Because we know the symptoms. What we need is, how do we address these root cause problems? Because that's where the struggle is. Like, we have a number of trainings on, awareness on gender equality, addressing gender-based violence, but are we addressing the structural issues? Are we working together to change this dynamics, or we are just, looking at the symptoms and addressing them? And the last point I would want to make is, can we also have some good practices, like one of the colleagues who presented the tool said, be there, so that there is positive investment from all stakeholders to utilize them. Because when you see too many tools, you sometimes feel, does it add value? Is it addressing the problem, or this is one of the many products you have in the market? So can we show some good practices with the tools that, okay, we've identified this particular problem and then remediate it? Of course, maybe it again reoccurs, but can we show these pathways of change with the tools that we are saying? And before I close, I want to put 2 points very quickly. One, which also colleagues around the table said, that we need the representation of women in these discussions. We need women voices more stronger in these discussions. Do not undermine the agency of women workers, and I use a generic term, in these discussions. When they have stepped out, have the double burden of care, responsibility, still work these odd hours, they have a lot of power. You cannot undermine it at all. You have to recognize that. And last, I push for ratification of C190. That's a very, very important, strong tool that addresses gender violence in the world of work, expanding the definition of workplace from just being a mere physical territory to the whole work till home-based workers. So
Yes.
let's keep working in our countries to push for ratification, and that's where we'll bridge this national, international legislation gap and push for better working conditions for workers worldwide. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mushmi. Important words on which to end this particular part of the discussion, I have to say. Women's voice and agency absolutely has to be front and center. Ratification of Convention 190, another important tool that we can add to the package. Let me hand over without further delay to Surya, because I think it's so important to hear your concluding remarks, Surya. So straight over to you.
Thank you very much, Chindi, and all the panelists. I think it has been a very enriching discussion. I thoroughly enjoyed it. It's almost impossible to provide a concluding overview of what has been discussed, but I will just like to make 3 or 4 broad points. First of all, tools and guidance are useful and there are plenty available. But the crucial thing is that tools and the guidance documents, they do not change the power imbalances. So what we need is the political will on the part of the states and businesses and investors and trade unions to bring a shift in the culture. This culture which exploits women both at home or in factories or in society generally, this discrimination which has been entrenched, that has to be fought. What is also crucial is that we keep focus on the rights-based narrative. We're not talking about charity. Women and all of us, in fact, have a right to equality. We have a right to be treated with dignity in the same manner. And because of that, it should not be merely an afterthought or feel-good element for businesses to integrate a gender perspective. It is an essentially a right that women have, and it is a duty which is increasingly becoming a duty because of the mandatory human rights due diligence legislation. And I very much hope that tomorrow when the European Commission releases the draft, it has a gender perspective into it. My last point is that often we talk about do no harm. But what I always stress is that do no harm is the starting point. Both states and businesses also need to make positive contributions to achieve substantive gender equality. And I think they need to work together. And I think if they do that, that will also result in achieving sustainable development goals, including SDG 5. Thank you very much for making me part of this very exciting seminar. And I look forward to working with all of you in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Surya. Thank you to all of the panelists, and thank you, Chidi, for your moderation. Thank you to my colleagues at Fokus for organizing such a strong event. This has really been very insightful. I think we've covered so much ground, from identifying impacts briefly to thinking about tools that are out there, to thinking about where those tools still fall short in addressing the real causes of the problems, not just the symptoms of the problems. And I appreciate the note that Surya has left us on, looking at mandatory solutions to changing long-standing cultural biases that are being used to the advantage of the garment sector to produce cheaper work. So a quick note to everyone who's asked questions. We will respond to the questions, unfortunately not now in spoken manner, but through sending out answers to participants after the workshop. We've run out of time today. But please do stay in touch with us if you have thoughts and ideas on this. And thank you again all for your participation and your good questions that you did ask along the way. We look forward to reviewing and answering them over writing. Thank you. Take care. Enjoy the rest of the forum.